The world you believe you know is a lie draped in the comforting hymns of churches, the solemn vows of men in robes, the invisible ink of morality written over horrors no one day speak aloud. 8 seconds. That is all it takes for a secret to change everything. Imagine a small village in 1845. The streets smell of wet earth, smoke curling from low roofs. Children play with innocent laughter, but behind one closed door, an unspeakable betrayal takes place. A priest, a man sworn to protect the souls of the innocent, holds a baby in his hands. The mother's eyes glisten with hope, trust, devotion. She believes in God, in the sacred ritual about to unfold. But the truth, hidden for centuries, is far darker. This priest, cloaked in sanctity, baptizes the child not to bless it, but to claim ownership. And then, he does something no mother could ever anticipate. He sells the baby back to her. Not as charity, not as compassion, but as a transaction. The baby, a human life, becomes a commodity. The church's altar, meant to safeguard innocence, becomes a marketplace of moral corruption. This was not rumor, nor legend whispered in shadows. It was a system, a network of hidden agendas where the clergy exercised power beyond faith, where human lives were instruments in a greater design of control. Think about it. How many truths like this have been sanitized by history, covered with polished words, forgotten names, erased records? The real horror isn't the act, it's the silence that followed. Generations passed without a soul daring to question. The psychological control ran deeper than fear. It ran through the very structure of belief, conditioning the faithful to accept authority unquestioned. Every sermon reinforced obedience, every ritual a lesson in subservience, every act of supposed compassion concealing exploitation. And yet, the mothers retained. They believed they were participating in sacred rites, unaware that their grief, their hope, and their love had been manipulated. This is the world of forbidden knowledge, the hidden machinery of human suffering cloaked as virtue. And now, as you sit there watching, I am about to pull you deeper, past the veil where morality dissolves, and the grotesque truth of history begins to breathe. Your mind will strain, your comfort will falter, because what you are about to learn is the blueprint of control, the anatomy of betrayal, the very system that allowed a man of God to treat children as currency. If you thought the past was safe, you are wrong. You need to understand something before we descend further. Corruption at this scale never begins with a single man. A priest does not wake up one morning and decide to turn infants into currency. No, these monstrosities grow from soil already poisoned. They grow from institutions that learned long ago how to weaponize faith, how to bend obedience into profit, how to cloak exploitation under the warm glow of candlelight and scripture. In 1845, villages across Europe and the Americas trusted their priests more than they trusted kings, doctors, or law. A priest could step into a home uninvited, pry into marriages, dictate what was sin, what was salvation, what was allowed. Power like that is a narcotic, quiet, invisible, and intoxicating. And in the shadows of that authority, a new form of commerce emerged, the trafficking of innocence itself. Imagine the priest again, his hands steady, his voice calm, his expression unchanged as he splashes water on the infant's forehead. To the mother, it is holy water. To him, it is ink, inking his ownership, signing a contract she cannot see. And when he hands the baby back, he demands payment. Not a donation, not a tithe, a fee, a price for allowing her to reclaim what was already hers. You might wonder, why didn't the mothers rebel? Why not expose him? But you're thinking like a modern man, free from the spiritual cages that once held entire communities hostage. In that world, a priest's word was divine law. To oppose him was to oppose God himself. A mother who questioned him risked not just shame, but damnation, eternal fire, eternal separation from her child in the afterlife. So she paid, again and again. But here's the truth they never wrote in the history books. This practice spread because it worked. The church saw desperate mothers, frightened families, and it saw opportunity. Records show baptism fees skyrocketing in certain regions. Infants became leverage. Mothers became clients. Faith became a marketplace. And behind it all, the psychological machinery spun silently, conditioning obedience, manufacturing guilt, reinforcing dependence. You think manipulation is modern. You think propaganda was invented in the 20th century. No, it began in the pews, whispered from pulpits, disguised as salvation. And now, as you listen, I want you to feel the shift inside yourself. That flicker of discomfort. That sense that something you trusted about the world is beginning to fracture. Good. Hold on to that. Because we are only at the threshold. What comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about institutions, about morality, about the forces shaping men's lives from the shadows. Let me take you deeper. This story isn't about one priest in one village. It's a window into a system, a network of power and secrecy that has haunted humanity for centuries. The church, a supposed bastion of purity and guidance, had discovered an irresistible truth. The human psyche is pliable, malleable, and desperate for approval. And where there is desperation, there is control. Every baptism, every sermon, every ritual became a lever. One man's greed could have been an anomaly, but when that greed is embedded in an institution, it becomes a mechanism for domination. The priest who sold babies back to their mothers was not a villain in isolation. He was a cog in a machine designed to maintain obedience, to normalize suffering, and to profit from faith itself. Picture the process. A mother walks into the church, trembling, her newborn swaddled in fragile cloth. The priest greets her with a smile, a voice soft yet commanding. "This is holy work," he says. She believes him. She kneels. She offers her trust, her innocence, even her love. And in that very act of devotion, she is being trained, conditioned, taught that submission is sacred, that questioning is sin, that to resist is to invite catastrophe. Meanwhile, the priest collects payments, not in the obvious coin of the realm alone, but in something far more insidious, psychological ownership. He has marked the mother, imprinted authority on her mind, and she will carry that imprint for life. The child is returned, but not free. The mother is returned, but not whole. Their faith, once pure, now binds them to a system designed to exploit them. And it doesn't stop there. Networks like these thrive because they understood secrecy. Records were coded, conversations whispered, accusations buried beneath layers of social fey. Even if a villager glimpsed the truth, the risk of speaking was unbearable. Reputation, damnation, ostracism, the mechanisms of control were as spiritual as they were social. What you see now, as a modern man, is merely the shadow of that power. Imagine the centuries it took for these methods to evolve, to refine themselves into subtler forms of manipulation. Schools, governments, families, each could replicate the same conditioning. The blueprint for authority, obedience, and exploitation was already etched into the psyche of humanity, all starting with trust betrayed at the altar of supposed sanctity. And here's where I want you to feel the weight. History is not written by truth, but by those who survive it while controlling its narrative. Every act of hidden corruption leaves a trace, a blueprint, a lesson for the next generation. And if you think you are safe, that this is distant history, remember this. The same structures, the same tactics, the same psychology, they are alive today. You have been trained to ignore it, conditioned to believe comfort is morality. But the moment you see it, truly see it, your perception of power, and your place within it, changes forever. Now, feel this, because this is where the horror becomes intimate. The infants themselves, innocent and unaware, were the axis around which this corruption spun. They were baptized in the name of God, their tiny heads crowned with water and oil, their futures already bound by a system that viewed life as a ledger entry. These children, the most defenseless among us, were the instruments of a dark lesson. Trust authority, obey without question, and love will always be contingent. And the mothers, oh, the mothers, carried the invisible chains. They would leave the church cradling their child, feeling the warmth of flesh and spirit, and yet the transaction had already been made. They had paid a price for what was already theirs. That price was obedience. That price was submission. That price was their perception of reality itself. Imagine the psychological scars. Not the visible ones. There were none, but the ones that twist beneath the surface. The mother, believing in divine blessing, is simultaneously taught that her child is a commodity. The priest, smiling, preaching, speaking of heaven and sin, has turned love into leverage. And that child, innocent, grows up within a framework of control they cannot yet see. The act itself is sinister, but the lesson, the conditioning, is far more dangerous. Humans, when trained from birth to obey unquestioned authority, to accept arbitrary punishment, to conflate fear with morality, become vessels for manipulation for life. That is the true darkness of this story. Not merely theft or corruption, but a blueprint for psychological domination that spans generations. And this is where history's silence is deafening. No court records, no grand exposés, no monument to victims. The story survives only in whispers, in fragmented accounts, in the murmur of villagers too afraid to speak the truth. It's a pattern repeated across continents, authority cloaked in sacred robes, exploiting trust, leveraging obedience, normalizing suffering. Institutions, powerful beyond measure, learn to hide the grotesque within the familiar. And what appears righteous to the naive eye is often the very mechanism of control. By now, you may be feeling unease. Good. That unease is the first crack in the armor of indoctrination. It is the moment when perception begins to shift, when comfort falters, when your mind begins to question the narratives handed to you without scrutiny. This story, though centuries old, is alive. It breathes through modern systems, through subtle manipulations, through the silent agreements we make with authority figures. And the deeper we go, the more you will begin to see how carefully power has been honed, perfected, and hidden in plain sight. You're ready for the next layer, the one most people never reach, because it requires confronting a truth far more disturbing than a corrupt priest. A single predator can terrorize a village, but a network, coordinated, silent, protected, can shape entire eras. And that is exactly what happened. What you witnessed in that small church was not an isolated deviation. It was a symptom of a deeper rut, one woven into the fabric of 19th century authority. Behind every priest who dared twist faith into commerce, there were officials, elders, and overseers who knew enough to intervene, yet never did. Think about it. Corruption this blatant leaves a trail. Mothers talked. Villagers whispered. Rumors swelled. And yet, no punishment. No investigation. No public rebuke. Why? Because the priest wasn't merely an individual. He was an asset. A node in a network where spiritual authority controlled the psychological climate of an entire region. And when an institution relies on obedience, it will protect its enforcers at any cost. These priests held the keys to confession, guilt, and social order, power far more potent than any police force. They could expose a family or save them. They could shame a man or sanctify him. They were the gatekeepers between fear and forgiveness. And institutions protect their gatekeepers. Always. Behind closed doors, church officials discussed discipline not in terms of morality, but optics. They knew the darker practices. They knew the profits flowing in from ritual fees, penance offerings, and baptismal transactions. They saw how it filled their ledgers, funded their expansions, strengthened their grip on communities, and they quietly agreed never to question methods that maintained the order. That phrase, maintain the order, is the hallmark of every corrupt system throughout history. It is the shield behind which atrocities hide. But the silence of authority wasn't the only factor. There were enablers, village elders who looked away, mothers who warned their daughters never to speak, fathers who feared exile more than injustice. Not because they approved, but because they had already been conditioned to bow. They had spent lifetimes learning that questioning a priest was inviting disaster, social ruin, divine wrath, or worse, ostracism. You think today's cancel culture is harsh? Imagine being cut off from the only community you depended on for survival. Shelter, food, reputation. It all hung on compliance. And this network of silence created something more terrifying than oppression. It created normalcy. Once exploitation becomes normal, it becomes invisible. Once power learns it can act without consequence, it becomes absolute. That is why these rituals persisted. Why mothers paid. Why babies were commodified. Why the priest grew bolder each year. Because the system allowed it. Because the system needed it. Because the system was built on it. And now, you're beginning to see the shape of it. The machinery behind the mask of holiness. But we are nowhere near the bottom yet. The next layer reveals how these practices evolved into sophisticated psychological control systems that still operate today, cloaked in modern language and institutional respectability. Listen closely, because this is where the story shifts from history into psychology, the invisible architecture of control. The priest who sold babies was not simply a predator. He was a practitioner of a much older, more insidious art, the art of conditioning obedience. Every ritual he performed, every infant he baptized, every mother he manipulated was a lesson in authority. Humans, particularly when vulnerable and desperate, are remarkably easy to train. Fear, guilt, shame, and hope, the emotional levers the priest pulled, are timeless tools. And here's the terrifying truth. These same tools are used today, in ways far more subtle, by institutions you trust, by systems you obey without question. Think about the act itself. A mother kneels, her newborn cradled in trembling arms. The priest raises his voice, intoning sacred words. Water touches the child's forehead. He smiles, nods, and returns the infant. But the price has already been exacted. Not the coin in his hand, not the transaction in writing. The price is the mother's psyche. The price is her conditioning. She leaves the church believing she has participated in a sacred act, and yet she has internalized a deeper truth. Authority is absolute. Authority decides morality. Authority determines your access to safety, love, and meaning. This is how control embeds itself, not through force alone, but through belief. And belief, once installed, is harder to break than any chain. The network around him reinforced this at every turn. Elders, church officials, even peers, every actor in the village played a role in normalizing obedience. Silence became consent. Devotion became complicity. And over time, the lessons extended beyond ritual. Children observed the unspoken hierarchies. Mothers carried stories of fear and guilt into their households. Communities became living classrooms of submission, trained to accept authority without question. Generations passed these lessons down, never recognizing them as mechanisms of control. And here's the crucial part. The human mind craves meaning. That craving is exploited. The priest offered purpose through ritual. He offered reassurance through faith. He offered social acceptance in exchange for compliance. And with each interaction, he rewrote reality for his flock. What is sacred becomes transactional. What is moral becomes conditional. And the victim, the mother, the child, the observer, is complicit in their own subjugation, unknowingly reinforcing the very system that enslaves them psychologically. If you feel a shiver down your spine, good. That is awareness awakening. That is the moment when the comfortable narrative of morality begins to crack. Hold on to that feeling. It is your gateway into the deeper truths that most men never see. We will examine the horrifying economic incentives behind these rituals, and how profit and power merge to create an unstoppable system of exploitation. Now we confront the cold, undeniable calculus behind this horror. Profit. Yes, beneath the sanctity, beneath the rituals, beneath the prayers, there was money. Not just coins, not just tithes, but calculated exploitation disguised as piety. Every baptism fee, every penance offering, every infant returned at a price was part of a deliberate system, a machine designed to extract wealth under the guise of spiritual service. This was not happenstance. It was not a priest's private vice. It was institutionalized. And institutions protect what generates power, even when that power corrupts the very souls it claims to save. Imagine the ledger, mothers desperate to secure blessings for their children, willingly paying, believing they are performing sacred duty. Each transaction reinforced obedience. Each transaction funded the church's hierarchy. And here's the cruelest truth. The mother's fear, the child's innocence, the family's hope. None of it mattered beyond its utility as currency. These babies were collateral in a system that thrived on emotional leverage. The act of buying back one's own child became normalized because the system made it so. And normalization is the engine of corruption. When acts of exploitation are rendered acceptable by ritual, by law, by belief, they cease to shock. They cease to threaten. They simply exist. And the priest, he grew bolder, not because he was greedy, but because the system rewarded him for his compliance. He understood the rules of the network. Silence equals power. Fear equals control. Obedience equals profit. He operated within a structure that encouraged cunning, masked cruelty, and the manipulation of the human spirit. And every successful transaction reinforced the hierarchy above him, binding the village, the mothers, the children, and the surrounding authorities into a web of dependence and domination. But notice this, the horror here is not just physical or economic, it is psychological. Money is the vehicle, but control is the payload. Every coin extracted carries with it the weight of submission. Every ritual, every act of perceived sanctity, teaches obedience. And over time, obedience becomes instinctive, unquestioned. Communities internalize hierarchy. Families accept authority. Individuals conflate fear with morality. A system like this does not need guards or chains. It needs trust in the wrong hands. And that is precisely what makes it unstoppable. Now, we step into the shadows where secrecy becomes sacred. Because without concealment, the priest's dark trade would have collapsed under scrutiny. And yet, it flourished, not in spite of secrecy, but because of it. Every whisper of doubt, every maimed accusation, every frightened neighbor who glimpsed the truth was swiftly absorbed into a culture of silence. Fear alone could not hold it together. It required ritual, hierarchy, and indoctrination. The community was conditioned to see the church not as an exploiter, but as protector. The very hands that took were celebrated as holy. The voices that demanded obedience were treated as divine. Think of the logistics. Records were minimal, often cryptic, with codes or euphemisms to obscure reality. Clergy trained in discretion became gatekeepers of information. Mothers were instructed in proper conduct, taught to accept what happened as God's will. Any deviation, any hint of rebellion, was not only spiritually condemned, but socially punished. Shame became a weapon, wielded with precision. And it was effective. Humans will endure almost anything if they believe resistance equals damnation, exile, or catastrophe. This is why institutionalized secrecy is more powerful than brute force. The system taught the villagers that knowledge itself is dangerous. To see the truth is to risk it all. And the ritual, every baptism, every prayer, every payment served dual purposes. The public act satisfied appearances, while the private consequences encoded obedience. Imagine the mother leaving the church, heart pounding, believing in blessing, yet unknowingly reinforcing the priest's authority. Every moment, every interaction, was a subtle lesson. You are beholden to power greater than yourself, and it decides the terms of your life. This is not theory. This is psychological engineering, perfected over centuries by institutions that survive by controlling perception, not just behavior. The broader implication is staggering. These methods did not die with the priest or the village. They evolved. They infiltrated other systems, schools, governments, hospitals, even modern corporate hierarchies. The mechanisms remain: fear, guilt, indoctrination, enforced silence. The patterns repeat, adapted to each era. And those who recognize it, the rare few, see the structures shaping human behavior everywhere. They understand that power always hides in plain sight, often draped in robes of respectability or sanctity. Now, we descend into the unspoken economy of souls, a market that history refuses to name. What the priest practiced was not a singular act of corruption. It was part of a broader blueprint for controlling humanity through trust, faith, and obligation. Every baptism, every child sold back to its mother, every whispered assurance of divine favor was a thread woven into a web of manipulation. And here's the part most men never understand. The web was not built to trap infants alone. It was designed to ensnare the mothers, the families, the entire village, and through them, the psyche of generations. The mechanism is subtle, almost invisible. Begin with dependence. The mother trusts the priest because survival, protection, and acceptance depend on it. Introduce fear. Obedience is enforced through guilt and the promise of eternal judgment. Layer in ritual. Sacred acts teach that compliance is holy, deviation sinful. And finally, inject commerce. A tangible exchange solidifies submission, making the lesson stick. The result is not merely a transaction. It is a transformation. Ordinary humans, under duress and conditioned belief, internalize authority as morality itself. That is how control survives centuries, hidden behind ceremonies and civility. And yet, even within the shadows, there were hierarchies. Not every priest could bend the system with equal skill. The most effective were masters of perception, understanding which levers to pull, which fears to exploit, and how to maintain plausible deniability. They knew that power is most enduring when invisible. The mother leaving the church, relieved to have her child returned, had no idea she had been mocked psychologically. Her trust, her fear, her faith, each became a resource extracted for power. And the village itself became a laboratory in obedience, teaching subsequent generations the same lessons without the priest ever raising a hand in violence. The tragedy, if you want to call it that, is how human nature is exploited. Desire, love, hope, guilt, and fear. These are not just emotions. They are levers of control. The priest understood that better than any scholar of the human mind. The institutions that protected him understood it even better. And you begin to see a pattern. This is not historical accident. This is design. Humans have been trained, over centuries, to cede power to authority figures disguised as protectors, saints, or wise men. The transactions may no longer involve infants, but the psychological architecture remains intact, refined, and thriving today. Now we confront the law, or at least, the illusion of it, because while the priest's actions were grotesque, they were shielded by a carefully constructed legal and social framework. Laws in 1845 were not designed to protect the vulnerable, they were designed to protect the powerful. The priest could baptize and sell a child back with impunity because the law deferred to divine authority. Church and state were intertwined, and in that entanglement, morality became malleable. Obedience was law, and law was obedience. Any mother attempting to challenge the transaction faced not just social condemnation but potential legal peril. Think about the implications. Authority under the guise of holiness becomes untouchable. Records were kept intentionally ambiguous. Terms like baptism fee and penance offering hid the transactional reality. A mother paying to reclaim her child was not seen as exploited. She was fulfilling her religious duty. Villages, enforcers of social norms, and local officials all reinforced the system. Compliance was rewarded with safety and social standing. Resistance was punished with ostracism, spiritual condemnation, or worse. In this way, the legal system became a weapon, not of justice, but of concealment. And make no mistake, the law was flexible for those who understood its loopholes. Priests and their superiors were experts in navigating moral gray zones. Written statutes provided cover. Oral traditions reinforced obedience. Even the threat of scandal was neutralized by the fear of divine judgment. No one dared publicly challenge a man claiming spiritual authority, because to do so was to risk not only worldly consequences but eternal ones. In essence, law and faith merged into a tool of psychological control. The subtlety is remarkable. Innocence, trust, and desperation were weaponized. Every act of compliance validated the system. Every silence reinforced power. Mothers returned home with their children, their lives intact on the surface, but the invisible architecture of obedience had been strengthened. Communities learned to self-regulate, to perpetuate the cycle without any further coercion. The system, once in motion, became self-sustaining. Now, let's strip away any illusions of randomness. The priest's crimes, horrifying as they were part of a meticulously maintained cycle, a fusion of greed, power, and spiritual authority. These elements, when combined, create a force almost impossible to resist. Greed ensured that every transaction generated profit, reinforcing the incentive for continued exploitation. Power guaranteed that the act could be performed without consequence. And spiritual authority provided the psychological cover. It justified the act, masked the exploitation, and conditioned the victims to accept it as divinely sanctioned. The cycle was self-reinforcing, and it thrived because everyone involved had a role to play, even if unknowingly. Consider the mothers once more. Each transaction was a lesson in obedience. They paid, complied, and returned home, believing themselves virtuous. In reality, they had internalized the rules of the system, becoming its silent enforcers. Villages observed, learned, and repeated. Children absorbed the behaviors of their elders, unknowingly participating in the perpetuation of authority. What looks like faith is, at its core, psychological conditioning. Every act of pious submission is a brick in the invisible walls of control. And the priest? He understood this architecture better than anyone. Every baptism, every whispered reassurance, every subtle manipulation was part of a deliberate strategy. His personal gain was inseparable from the system's survival. The cycle demanded both cunning and ruthlessness. He had to maintain the appearance of sanctity while exploiting the very trust that sanctity engendered. Any slip, any exposure, could unravel the network, but the structure around him was designed to prevent that. Silent enablers, complicit officials, and fierce communities all ensured the system's continuity. Now feel the weight of this realization. The horror is not isolated to a single man or a single village. It is a study in how human institutions, religious, legal, social, can be weaponized to extract compliance, to manipulate perception, and to normalize exploitation. Once you see the blueprint, you can identify it anywhere. Modern institutions, governments, even corporations operate using similar psychological leverage, only the symbols have changed. The mechanics remain the same. Trust, fear, ritual, and reward, woven together to mold behavior. And this is why knowledge is dangerous. Because understanding the system means seeing yourself and your society through a lens that many will resist. It requires recognizing the invisible levers shaping human lives for centuries. And it demands courage, because the moment you perceive control, you are no longer passive, you are awake. Now, we enter the human cost, the scars that are invisible but indelible. The mothers carried their children home, outwardly intact, yet internally fractured. Every smile, every embrace, every whispered prayer was overlaid with a subtle imprint of control. They had learned, whether consciously or not, that love could be commodified, that trust could be weaponized, and that their obedience was not just expected, it was enforced. The lesson was cruel and enduring. To survive, comply, to question, suffer. And this psychological conditioning did not vanish with the passing of a year, a decade, or a lifetime. It was encoded in behaviors, in fears, in the very lens through which they viewed authority. And the children, innocent vessels of this system, absorbed more than we might imagine. They were baptized into more than faith. They were baptized into the rules of control. To grow up under a priest who could claim ownership over life itself is to internalize a hierarchy where power is absolute, unquestioned, and morally justified. The child learns, without words, that compliance is safety, that authority equals morality, that love is conditional. These lessons shape identity, self-worth, and the capacity for trust. Generations are molded in the shadows of these invisible lessons, long after the priest and village have faded into history. But the most insidious part, the mothers themselves became instruments of the system. Conditioned by fear and faith, they reinforced the very architecture that had manipulated them. They warned daughters, counseled neighbors, and structured households around obedience. The cycle propagated naturally. Human compliance was no longer maintained by overt coercion. It was self-sustaining. Psychological chains, once invisible, became inherited. The priest may have been a single actor, but the consequences radiated outward, embedding themselves in culture, in social norms, and in family legacies. And yet, the system thrives not only on obedience but on secrecy. Fear of exposure silenced voices. Shame prevented confession. And the understanding of what was truly happening, the transactional betrayal disguised as sacrament, remained hidden. Those who sensed the injustice often rationalized it, excused it, or accepted it as unavoidable, because that is how survival works in oppressive hierarchies. Human nature becomes both victim and enforcer. Here is where you must pause and absorb the weight. History does not merely record events, it encodes psychological architecture. What you are witnessing is the blueprint of manipulation, perfected over now. We expose the silent conspirators, the enablers who never held a child, never baptized, yet ensured the system endured. The priest could not operate in isolation. He depended on a lattice of authority, bishops who ignored whispers of impropriety, village elders who valued conformity over justice, even ordinary parishioners who turned blind eyes in exchange for perceived safety. These were not passive observers, they were active participants in a conspiracy of silence. Their complicity was the lubricant that allowed corruption to flow smoothly, hidden in plain sight. Consider the elders and officials. They were the guardians of law, morality, and reputation. And yet, when confronted with transgressions, they chose protection over accountability. Why? Because maintaining order was more valuable than delivering justice. The community's perception of holiness mattered more than the welfare of children. Fear of scandal, fear of divine wrath, fear of social upheaval. All these forces ensured that the priest's abuses were shielded from scrutiny. By reinforcing the illusion of sanctity, the enablers guaranteed the cycle would continue. This pattern repeats endlessly in history. At every level, from local authorities to global institutions, humans have demonstrated an uncanny ability to preserve power by ignoring the suffering they witness. Silent complicity is as potent as active malice. When people abdicate responsibility for fear, convenience, or self-interest, they are not neutral, they are accomplices. The priest's dark trade relied on this principle. Without passive support, his actions would have been unsustainable. With it, they became normalized, legitimized, and perpetuated. Even ordinary villages, bound by social norms and spiritual conditioning, played their role. Their whispers, rumors, and unspoken fears became invisible barriers to justice. Each act of silence was a reinforcement of authority, a confirmation that deviation was dangerous. And within this web, power was never questioned. Compliance became instinctive, morality became a tool, and human life, in the most vulnerable form, became negotiable. Recognize this now. The horror was systemic, not accidental. It thrived because humans are trained to obey, conditioned to fear, and conditioned to preserve the institutions that exploit them. Authority, once masked as holiness, becomes untouchable. And the pattern is not confined to 1845. It persists today, in institutions, corporations, and governments where obedience is enforced and questioning is discouraged. Now, feel the weight of what is invisible, the imprint left on identity itself. The mothers, the children, the villages, all unknowingly became prisoners of a psychological architecture that outlived the immediate horror. Trust, once sacred, was now conditional. Love, once pure, was now intertwined with fear. The child learned that power could override innocence. The mother learned that obedience was survival, and generations absorbed these lessons silently, repeating the behaviors without conscious recognition. The system did not just exploit humans, it reprogrammed them. Consider the lasting consequences. A mother, who once believed that her child's well-being depended solely on her devotion, now understands that safety is negotiated through compliance. A child, raised in this environment, internalizes authority as morality itself. Questioning the priest or the institution becomes an act of betrayal, a spiritual threat, even if nothing in their rational mind confirms it. Identity becomes fused with obedience. Autonomy is subordinated to authority. And the cycle repeats, not because humans are inherently weak, but because their minds have been subtly trained to accept control as a law of existence. And here is the critical insight most men overlook. This is not merely historical. The same patterns manifest in modern systems, corporations, governments, education, and even family hierarchies. The levers are different, the rituals updated, the language sanitized, but the mechanics remain identical. Trust is weaponized, obedience is rewarded, silence is enforced. Institutions that appear protective often operate with the same logic. Compliance equals privilege, defiance equals punishment. What you witnessed in a small 1845 village is simply an archetype of a universal principle. Control thrives where humans surrender their critical faculties. This is why awareness is dangerous. Once you perceive the architecture, you cannot unsee it. You recognize the subtle levers in your own life, the pressures you never questioned, the norms you instinctively followed, the authority you accepted unquestioned. This awakening is unsettling because it forces recognition that power rarely requires overt violence. It requires the quiet extraction of trust, the manipulation of desire, and the orchestration of fear. Now, we descend into the theater of control, the rituals themselves. Because the priest's power was not simply brute force or financial greed, it was theatrical, psychological, and deeply symbolic. Each baptism was a performance, meticulously designed to reinforce authority and manipulate belief. Candles flickered, water was consecrated, oil was applied, and words, carefully chosen, solemnly intoned, constructed a reality in which obedience became sanctity, and submission equated to morality. Every gesture, every syllable, every shadow in that small church was a lesson in compliance. The mother, standing before the altar, is not merely participating in a spiritual ceremony. She is being conditioned. The water touching her child's forehead is a symbol of ownership disguised as blessing. The priest's voice, calm and authoritative, is the subtle hammer shaping her perception. Trust authority, obey authority, respect authority. The infant, wrapped in swaddling, is a living emblem of vulnerability. By controlling the most defenseless, the priest establishes a hierarchy in which power is unquestionable. Every participant leaves believing they have witnessed sacred acts, yet they have internalized psychological rules that will shape behavior for life. Ritual is extraordinarily effective because it appeals to the subconscious. Humans instinctively attribute meaning to symbols, gestures, and repeated patterns. The priest exploited this instinct. Candles represented divine oversight, water represented purification, and the act of paying, coerced or voluntary, was framed as a moral obligation. Each element reinforced submission and normalized the underlying exploitation. The brain does not distinguish easily between spiritual devotion and conditioned obedience. Repeated exposure trains the mind to accept the hierarchy as natural. And here's the deeper layer. The community itself becomes a participant in reinforcing the ritual. Observers witness the ceremony, absorb the authority being enacted, and validate it through silence or admiration. Compliance spreads beyond the mother and child. It infects the social fabric. Fear, reverence, and desire for approval all conspire to maintain the system. The ritual is not merely an isolated act. It is the mechanism that sustains the architecture of control. Now we confront the invisible network, the unseen architecture that allowed these rituals to thrive. The priest alone could not sustain this system. He depended on a lattice of enablers, supervisors, and complicit authorities who ensured the mechanisms of control remained intact. Bishops turned blind eyes. Village elders prioritized order over justice. Ordinary parishioners whispered warnings that never materialized into action. Every participant, willing or coerced, became part of a larger machine designed to perpetuate obedience and silence. This network was sophisticated in its simplicity. Silence was enforced not by chains or threats of violence, but through psychological leverage, fear of divine punishment, social ostracism, and moral condemnation. Those who questioned the system were quickly isolated, subtly shamed, or convinced their doubts were sinful. Compliance, on the other hand, was rewarded with safety, approval, and spiritual reassurance. Over time, these subtle pressures created a self-sustaining system where obedience became instinctive, internalized, and nearly impossible to resist. And the consequences of this network extended beyond immediate exploitation. The mothers who returned home carrying their children also carried the weight of conformity. Their minds absorbed the lesson: authority is absolute, questioning is dangerous, and compliance ensures survival. Their behaviors were transmitted to their children, who in turn observed, internalized, and replicated the patterns. One act of betrayal became a generational architecture of control. The priest's deeds were amplified, not erased, by the community itself. Consider the economic incentives laid into this network. Each transaction, each infant bought back, generated profit, funding the expansion and consolidation of institutional power. Greed and obedience intertwined seamlessly, reinforcing the hierarchy. Every actor in the system, from the silent bishop to the compliant mother, was unknowingly participating in a grand design that elevated authority above morality. The lesson was clear. Survival depends on obedience, and moral judgment belongs to the institution, not the individual. Now, feel this as truth, because it is essential. Power does not need overt cruelty to dominate. Subtlety, ritual, silence, and complicity are more effective than chains or swords. The system works because humans are trained to trust it, fear it, and obey it, all while believing they are acting out of faith or reason. This network is a blueprint for control, a pattern that repeats across history and continues to operate in modern institutions. Now we confront the subtle, insidious power of identity transformation. The priest's actions, and the system surrounding him, did more than extract obedience. They reshaped how people saw themselves. The mothers, the children, the villages, all internalized rules they could not articulate. Every act of compliance, every ritual, every whispered assurance of divine sanction became a lesson in subjugation. Your life, your choices, your morality, they belong to authority. Over time, this internalization rewired self-perception. What was once independent thought became conditioned obedience. Fear, reverence, and hope fused into an identity that served the system without resistance. The child, returned to its mother, grew not only under the physical weight of the act, but under its psychological shadow. Authority became the metric for morality. Compliance became the standard for survival. Trust, once natural, was now filtered through the lens of hierarchy. The child learned the unspoken truth. Questioning power is dangerous, submission is safe, obedience is rewarded, and resistance is punished. And because the priest and the network designed this meticulously, the lesson felt divinely sanctioned, morally justified, inevitable. Identity, in other words, was shaped not by choice, but by manipulation. The mothers, too, were transformed. They carried the invisible chains of obedience, guilt, and fear. Every decision, every interaction, was subconsciously filtered through lessons learned in that small church. Their love, their hope, their devotion, all were entangled with the reality that authority dictated outcomes. Over time, this created a self-reinforcing cycle. The very people who were manipulated became the agents of their own continued conditioning, teaching the next generation compliance and fear as natural laws. And this is where you must pause and feel the weight of recognition. Identity is not fixed. It can be shaped, molded, exploited. When institutions, rituals, and psychological leverage converge, humans can unknowingly surrender the essence of themselves. The priest's act, seemingly singular, became a tool to reshape minds, beliefs, and self-perception. It was not merely commerce, it was architecture, crafting obedience into the DNA of the village. Now, here's your first active step into awakening. I want you to comment the phrase, "I see the pattern" below. Then, repeat it once more. Say it aloud if you wish. This is not trivial. It is a symbolic act of now that you have acknowledged the pattern. Let us descend further. The priest's actions were not anomalies. They were a model, a proof of concept for how power could be extended, hidden, and normalized. Spiritual authority, economic gain, and psychological manipulation converged to create a triad of domination. The church, the legal system, and the silent community formed concentric circles of reinforcement. Each circle ensured that obedience was automatic, dissent invisible, and exploitation sustainable. The lesson is chilling. Power does not need visibility to be absolute. It only needs structure, secrecy, and repetition. Economic leverage was subtle but potent. Each infant bought back was not only a transaction, it was a contract reinforcing obedience. The mother paid, the priest profited, and the institution expanded its reach. Every dollar, every coin, became a reinforcement of hierarchy. This economic layer ensured the network's endurance. Greed fused with faith, producing a system where survival, morality, and compliance were inseparable. And because the transaction appeared righteous, few questioned it. Fear and hope worked in tandem. Fear of divine punishment, hope for blessings and approval. The network used human desire to lock obedience into place. And the psychological impact? It was enduring. Mothers internalized guilt as moral law. Children internalized authority as morality. Villages internalized fear as necessity. Obedience became instinctive. Questioning authority became a form of existential risk. In this web, human minds became both victims and instruments of perpetuation. Compliance was no longer enforced. It was self-administered. The most dangerous systems are the ones that do not need enforcers. They train the people to enforce themselves. Spiritual authority, economic control, and social enforcement became inseparable. The priest's simple act of baptizing infants and selling them back illustrates a fundamental principle. Systems of domination thrive when morality, survival, and desire are intertwined. By the time a community recognizes exploitation, the structure is internalized, self-reinforcing, and nearly impossible to dismantle. It is quiet, invisible, and devastatingly effective. Now, we enter the generational web, the transmission of control across decades, even centuries. The priest's actions did not end with one mother, one child, or one village. They rippled outward, leaving invisible marks on families, on culture, on the very perception of authority. Children who witnessed these rituals internalized obedience as normal. Mothers who participated internalized compliance as morality. Villages who observed internalized fear as guidance. What begins as an isolated act of corruption becomes encoded into the social DNA, a blueprint repeated silently, unconsciously, from one generation to the next. Consider the mechanisms of this transmission. Stories are told, but sanitized. Lessons are reinforced through subtle cues. Obedience is praised, defiance punished. Faith becomes both instruction and instrument. Children absorb behavior before they can articulate it, forming a map of power, trust, and submission that shapes how they interact with every authority figure for the rest of their lives. Families reproduce the hierarchy instinctively, ensuring the architecture of obedience survives long after the initial perpetrators are gone. And the psychological consequences are profound. Trust becomes conditional, tied to authority. Fear becomes a compass for behavior. Love and devotion are entangled with obligation and submission. Identity itself is reshaped. Autonomy is sacrificed for perceived safety. Questioning is suppressed, and self-perception becomes inseparable from compliance. The system has trained its victims to perpetuate their own subjugation, all under the guise of morality and survival. This is the hidden genius of such manipulation. It requires no enforcement once internalized. The population becomes its own police force, enforcing the invisible rules with silent consent. Institutions, rituals, and authority figures are no longer necessary to coerce. They only need to exist as symbols. The human mind, once conditioned, does the rest. This is why these patterns persist for centuries, across cultures, and in countless forms. You see it not only in religious institutions, but in governments, corporations, education systems, and social hierarchies. The levers have changed, but the architecture remains intact. Now we confront the fusion of incentives, the financial, social, and spiritual levers that made this system nearly unstoppable. The priest scheme was not merely a crime of opportunity. It was a masterclass in aligning desire, fear, and authority to produce compliance. Mothers paid not only out of love for their children, but out of hope for spiritual favor and social acceptance. Fear of divine wrath, social exclusion, and moral condemnation reinforced every transaction. Every layer worked together, creating a self-reinforcing system where obedience was not optional. It was survival itself. Economic incentives ensured sustainability. Each transaction enriched the priest, his superiors, and the institution. Money became more than profit. It became validation. The flow of currency reinforced hierarchy, rewarded complicity, and funded expansion. Financial gain and spiritual authority intertwined, creating a network that could withstand moral scrutiny, exposure, and even whispered dissent. In essence, the system used human desire and fear as currency. Compliance itself became a commodity, traded for protection, approval, and blessing. Social pressures amplified the effect. Villagers observed the rituals and learned the rules of survival. Obedience is rewarded, questioning punished, silence valued. Mothers warned daughters. Fathers enforced norms. Communities internalized patterns of control, embedding them into daily life. The network did not require physical enforcement. It relied on invisible social compacts, subtle shaming, and communal reinforcement. Individuals became both victims and enforcers, perpetuating the system without conscious recognition. And the spiritual dimension sealed the architecture. Authority was cloaked in divinity. Obedience was sanctified. Resistance equated not only to social risk, but to moral and eternal peril. Fear and hope intertwined into an emotional lever that shaped behavior more powerfully than laws ever could. Humans, conditioned from birth to revere authority, learned that survival depended on compliance, and morality became inseparable from submission. Now, grasp this fully. The system was elegant in its cruelty. No single lever, fear, money, ritual, or authority was sufficient, but when combined, they created a structure that was almost impossible to break. Obedience became instinctive, compliance became internalized, and the population itself enforced the very rules that enslaved it. This is the blueprint of control, visible in 1845, hidden in plain sight, and still operating in subtler forms today. Now, we descend into the long-term psychological consequences, the silent, enduring scars that history rarely records. The mothers, the children, the villages, they were shaped, not just by one act, but by a pattern repeated in ritual, enforced by authority, and reinforced by the community. Obedience became instinct. Fear became a compass. Social conformity became morality itself. Over time, the architecture of manipulation embedded itself so deeply that its victims became its perpetuators without conscious recognition. Consider the children. Those who survived the baptismal transactions grew into adults whose understanding of authority was inseparable from trust and fear. Compliance was learned before comprehension. Questioning authority became not just dangerous, but unthinkable. Their identities were forged within the framework of obedience, and every interaction with elders, priests, or officials reinforced the blueprint. By adulthood, the lessons of that small church had become a self-sustaining structure, shaping behavior across every aspect of life. Mothers carried an invisible burden. Their love, hope, and devotion were bound to a system that normalized exploitation. Every decision, every action, was filtered through learned obedience. Even the act of nurturing became intertwined with the rules imposed by authority. Fear of divine retribution, fear of social exclusion, and fear of moral failure became psychological chains, guiding behavior without overt coercion. And the villages, conditioned by observation, whispered warnings, and subtle social reinforcement, ensured the system's survival. The architecture of control was invisible, yet absolute. What is terrifying is how naturally it perpetuated itself. Ritual, silence, social pressure, and spiritual authority combined to create a cycle where humans enforced their own subjugation. Compliance was internalized, making external enforcement almost unnecessary. The community itself became the mechanism of control. This is why such systems endure for generations. They do not rely solely on power. They rely on shaping the minds of those subjected to it. Now, feel the weight of this knowledge. You are not merely learning history. You are seeing a blueprint of manipulation perfected over centuries. The same patterns appear today in institutions, governments, corporations, and social hierarchies. The levers may have changed, rituals may be modernized, authority cloaked in new symbols, but the mechanisms remain identical: fear, obedience, social reinforcement, and the quiet internalization of control. Now, we turn to the evolution of control, the way these ancient mechanisms of manipulation have survived and adapted into modern life. The same principles that allowed a priest to dominate a village in 1845 are not relics of history. They are encoded into contemporary institutions, corporations, and governments. Fear, ritual, obedience, and social reinforcement have simply changed form. The levers remain, but the symbols are new: bureaucracy, corporate hierarchy, social validation, and digital surveillance. Authority is still disguised as protection, morality, and progress. Consider the modern parallels. Just as the priest used baptism as both a ritual and a psychological tool, today's institutions use certifications, protocols, and societal norms to condition compliance. People submit, often eagerly, to rules and expectations, believing them to be neutral or benevolent, while in reality, they reinforce hierarchies and control behavior. Subtle rewards and punishments, praise, promotion, shaming, ostracism, mirror the mechanisms of fear and approval used in the past. Compliance becomes internalized. Obedience becomes instinctive. And the population enforces its own limits, just as it did centuries ago. Economics has also evolved. The transactional manipulation once visible in the exchange of infants now operates through debt, access, and consumer behavior. Fear of loss, hope of gain, and desire for social approval are leveraged to maintain obedience. People comply willingly because the system makes them believe it is necessary for survival, advancement, or moral good. Subtle coercion is far more effective than overt oppression. It ensures participation without visible force. The spiritual dimension, too, persists, though it is often secularized. Authority cloaked as morality, virtue, or expertise continues to command trust. Humans are conditioned to believe that those in positions of power inherently know what is best, and resistance is morally or socially risky. Rituals may appear mundane: workplace meetings, legal proceedings, academic ceremonies, but their effect is identical, shaping perception, conditioning obedience, and reinforcing hierarchies. Now, we examine the human mind, the ultimate instrument and perpetuator of control. The priest could not have succeeded without the compliance of those he manipulated. Fear, hope, and reverence were only effective because humans are wired to seek meaning, trust authority, and avoid social danger. Obedience, once internalized, does not require chains or punishment. The mind itself becomes the enforcer, and the individual unwittingly reproduces the system that oppresses them. Consider cognitive bias, the silent architect of compliance. Confirmation bias ensures that people see what they expect. The priest appears holy, authority is justified, and obedience feels virtuous. Social proof amplifies the effect. Everyone else is submitting, so submission becomes safe, even moral. Fear of judgment, rejection, or divine wrath shapes decisions before reasoning has a chance to intervene. Over time, these cognitive patterns hardwire themselves into behavior. The individual is not merely influenced, they are conditioned. And this is where identity becomes inseparable from authority. The mother, the child, the observer, all internalize the rules of the system. Questioning authority becomes existentially risky, not merely socially inconvenient. Autonomy is sacrificed for survival. Compliance is rewarded not by overt force but by the mind's own mechanisms, relief from fear, approval, and the illusion of safety. These invisible chains are far more effective than physical ones. They last generations and extend beyond geography or culture. Now, reflect on modern parallels. The same cognitive levers are employed in corporations, politics, education, and religion today. Subtle conditioning shapes choices, perception, and behavior. People obey rules they barely understand, follow authority they barely question, and reinforce systems they have been taught to trust. The architecture is the same, only the symbols have changed. And because it is invisible, it is nearly impossible to resist without conscious awareness. Now, we confront the possibility of liberation, the process of breaking free from conditioning and reclaiming control over your own mind. The first step is awareness, seeing the levers that have shaped your thoughts, emotions, and actions. Fear, compliance, reverence for authority. These were not accidental, they were cultivated. Recognizing them is not simply intellectual, it is visceral. It is the tightening in your chest when you see the pattern, the uneasy clarity that you are witnessing forces that have manipulated generations. This recognition awakens the first spark of autonomy. The second step is questioning. Every instruction, every expectation, every belief must be examined. Ask, does this serve me, or does it serve someone else's system of control? The priest's ritual was framed as sacred, the payment as duty, the silence as morality. In modern life, these lessons persist in subtler forms, unquestioned hierarchies, social pressures, and internalized norms. By questioning what you have been taught to accept instinctively, you start to disentangle obedience from your sense of self. The third step is action. Awareness alone is insufficient. You must practice refusal of automatic compliance, small acts of defiance, conscious choice in situations where most submit unconsciously. The mind is a muscle. Obedience can be unlearned and replaced with deliberate agency. This requires courage, patience, and vigilance. The priest system endured because no one exercised this courage. Those who do are rare, but they are the beginning of true mastery. And finally, integration. Understanding manipulation is not enough. You must internalize a framework of values, ethics, and self-governance. Rebuild your identity on principles that serve your autonomy rather than external authority. This is the final act of reclaiming power, converting awareness into action, action into habit, and habit into a new self who is no longer unknowingly complicit in systems of control. Now, we explore the consequences of awakening, the profound shift that occurs when you recognize the levers of control operating around you and within you. This is not a mild realization, it is an internal earthquake. Once you perceive the architecture of manipulation, nothing appears the same. Authority, tradition, ritual, and obedience are no longer neutral. They are instruments designed to shape your behavior, your relationships, your work, your understanding of morality. Everything is filtered through this lens. Awareness changes perception, and perception changes reality. The first consequence is discomfort. It is impossible to witness the mechanisms of control and remain untouched. The unease you feel is a signal. Your mind has begun recalibrating. Every social expectation, every inherited belief, every instinctive response is now subject to scrutiny. This discomfort is not a weakness. It is the sharpening of consciousness, the first step toward autonomy. The second consequence is empowerment. Once you see the pattern, you can anticipate it, resist it, and choose differently. The same rituals, rules, and pressures that once shaped you unconsciously now become data. You can navigate them strategically, consciously deciding which forces deserve your obedience and which do not. Awareness grants leverage over life in a way obedience never could. The third consequence is responsibility. Freedom is never passive. To recognize manipulation is to accept that you are accountable for your choices, for your identity, and for the perpetuation, or disruption, of systems around you. Ignorance excuses compliance. Awareness demands action. You cannot unsee the web of influence. You must now decide how to move through it. Finally, there is transformation. The knowledge that once would have terrified becomes a tool. Understanding the priest system, the generations of psychological conditioning, and the invisible hierarchies of power allows you to reconstruct your life intentionally. The same forces that enslaved others can now be neutralized, resisted, or harnessed in pursuit of self-mastery. Knowledge becomes armor, awareness becomes weaponry, and perception becomes sovereignty. Now, we trace the echoes of the past into the present. The priest's methods, ritualized control, psychological manipulation, economic leverage, did not vanish with history. They evolved. Institutions, corporations, governments, and social hierarchies adopted subtler versions of the same architecture. Fear, authority, ritual, and social approval became tools not just of survival, but of profit, compliance, and domination. The same levers are applied today, often invisible, often normalized, yet just as effective in shaping behavior, identity, and perception. Consider corporate hierarchies. Subtle rituals, performance reviews, meetings, certifications, mirror baptismal ceremonies in function, not form. Compliance is rewarded, dissent punished. Social observation and peer pressure reinforce norms. Fear of failure, hope of advancement, and belief in the legitimacy of authority ensure obedience. Employees, like the villages of 1845, internalize the rules, enforce them themselves, and perpetuate the system. The architecture is identical, only the symbols have changed. Governments operate similarly. Laws, regulations, and bureaucracies often mask control as protection. Citizens comply instinctively, conditioned by cultural, social, and historical frameworks. Fear of punishment, desire for acceptance, and trust in authority combine to produce internalized obedience. The public becomes a self-regulating mechanism. As in the past, the most effective systems require no visible enforcers. The mind itself enforces compliance. Even modern social structures, digital platforms, and cultural norms replicate these patterns. Likes, approvals, status symbols, and algorithmic validation manipulate behavior in ways strikingly analogous to ancient rituals. Humans respond predictably. Fear, hope, and desire become levers. Authority may now be a title, a follow account, or a brand, but the psychological mechanics remain consistent. Obedience is internalized, reinforced, and transmitted. Now, we uncover the methods of identification, the skills required to see manipulation before it shapes your mind. The first step is observation. Every ritual, rule, and expectation must be examined. Who benefits, who enforces it, and what emotions it leverages. Fear, desire, hope, and reverence are universal levers. Ask yourself, is this designed to protect me, or to ensure my compliance? Is obedience genuinely moral, or is it convenient for someone else's power? These questions are the mental lens through which the invisible architecture becomes visible. The second method is pattern recognition. Just as the priest used consistent rituals and social pressure to create obedience, modern systems rely on recurring signals, repetition, reward, punishment, and social validation. Learn to identify them. Meetings, approvals, promotions, cultural norms, even digital prompts can act as invisible chains. Awareness of patterns gives you predictive power. Once you recognize the levers, you can anticipate the influence and choose differently. Third is emotional detachment. Manipulation is effective because it hijacks feelings. Fear, hope, guilt, loyalty. To resist, you must acknowledge the emotional response without surrendering control. The unease you feel is not weakness, it is clarity. It signals that you are perceiving the structure of control. Use it as a compass rather than a cage. Train yourself to respond consciously rather than react automatically. Fourth, verification. Cross-check beliefs, instructions, and traditions against principles of reason, ethics, and autonomy. Just because authority declares it sacred or necessary does not mean it serves you. The priest's transactions were cloaked in ritual and faith. Modern levers are cloaked in bureaucracy, law, or social approval. Verification dismantles illusion and reinforces agency. Finally, practice defiance strategically. Small acts of conscious choice train the mind to recognize autonomy and resist invisible influence. Speak, act, or think differently where compliance is assumed. The goal is not rebellion for its own sake, but mastery over your own perception, decisions, and identity. Awareness alone is insufficient. It must be exercised. Now, we confront transformation, the profound shift that occurs when awareness, observation, and conscious defiance converge. Once you recognize the invisible levers shaping behavior, identity, and perception, you are no longer a passive participant in systems of control. You begin to reclaim authority over your mind, decisions, and life. The chains that once bound you, fear, obedience, internalized authority, begin to dissolve. Clarity replaces instinctive compliance. You start to see truth where others see ritual, and power where others see obligation. The first aspect of this transformation is perception. You notice subtleties in interactions, social pressures, and institutional behavior that previously went unseen. Ritual, reward, fear, and authority become data, not compulsion. You perceive influence, not inevitability. This expanded awareness allows you to navigate life strategically, making decisions that serve your autonomy rather than the agendas of hidden forces. Second, identity reshapes. No longer defined by unconscious obedience or conditioned compliance, you begin to construct a self rooted in agency, ethics, and deliberate choice. Fear becomes a signal, not a ruler. Authority becomes a tool, not a master. The internal architecture of control is visible, understood, and subject to conscious decision. This is psychological liberation, not merely freedom from external control, but freedom from internalized compliance. Third, behavior changes. Actions are deliberate, calculated, and aligned with conscious values rather than reflexive obedience. You recognize leverage points in social, institutional, and personal structures, and decide when to comply, when to resist, and when to manipulate situations for self-mastery rather than submission. The world is no longer a set of rules to obey. It is a system to understand and navigate intentionally. Finally, life itself transforms. The awakening to manipulation, the recognition of patterns, and the reclamation of autonomy create a new relationship with reality. Fear, ritual, and authority no longer dictate your decisions. You operate from understanding, strategy, and self-mastery. The knowledge that once terrified becomes empowerment. What once controlled you now serves as insight, fuel, and guidance. Now, we reach the ultimate revelation. Mastery over self and society is possible when you understand manipulation at its deepest level. The priest's dark architecture, the invisible levers of obedience, and the generations of internalized fear are not merely historical curiosities. They are mirrors. By studying them, you gain insight into the mechanics of power, influence, and control that govern every human system. Once you perceive these forces, you can anticipate, resist, and even leverage them strategically. You are no longer a pawn. You become a player. The first layer of mastery is psychological sovereignty. Understanding how fear, ritual, and authority shape behavior allows you to reclaim the most fundamental territory, your own mind. No longer manipulated by invisible patterns, you can observe them objectively and choose your response. Your thoughts, desires, and actions become deliberate instruments of power, rather than reflexive compliance. Autonomy becomes not just a concept, but a lived, practical reality. The second layer is social mastery. By recognizing the levers others respond to, fear, hope, reverence, conformity, you gain insight into influence without deception. You can navigate hierarchies, institutions, and relationships strategically, understanding both the vulnerabilities of others and the mechanics of their compliance. This does not require manipulation for selfish gain. It requires perception, discernment, and strategic foresight. Knowledge itself becomes power. The third layer is historical intelligence. By tracing the evolution of these systems, from the priest in 1845 to modern institutions, you can predict patterns, identify potential vulnerabilities, and operate in the world with a clarity few possess. You see the invisible structures that govern society and recognize where obedience is earned, coerced, or irrelevant. This allows action with precision, avoiding pitfalls that trap the unaware. Finally, the apex of mastery is ethical sovereignty. Awareness grants choice. You are free to comply, resist, or reshape the rules around you, but your decisions are conscious, intentional, and aligned with principles you control. You are no longer bound by rituals, authority, or fear. You wield understanding as armor and strategy as weaponry. The dark lessons of history, once terrifying, now illuminate your path. Now, we arrive at the final threshold, the knowledge that changes everything. You have seen the patterns, traced the levers, and understood the invisible forces that shape obedience, identity, and perception. This is dangerous knowledge. Once internalized, you cannot return to ignorance. Life before awareness is gone. You carry the weight of truth, that fear, ritual, authority, and social pressure are instruments of control, wielded subtly across centuries, across cultures, across every institution you encounter. This awareness is both liberation and responsibility. The first warning, ignorance was survival. In the world you have studied, those who remained blind were protected, compliant, and relatively safe. Knowledge brings risk. Seeing manipulation means seeing threats where others see none, understanding motives others deny, and recognizing hierarchies others trust blindly. The price of awareness is vigilance. You are now awake in a system designed to keep you asleep. The second truth, power is now within reach, but only if exercised wisely. Understanding the levers of obedience, fear, and ritual grants unprecedented influence, not only over yourself, but over the structures around you. Institutions, social hierarchies, and even human relationships operate according to patterns you can perceive and navigate deliberately. You are no longer a passive participant. You can choose compliance, resistance, or strategic engagement. Every action is now informed by insight. The third imperative, responsibility. Knowledge without ethical direction is perilous. Just as the priest's understanding of human psychology became a tool for exploitation, your insight can be weaponized or liberated. Mastery is not about domination alone. It is about choosing consciously, acting deliberately, and shaping your life with clarity. You cannot unsee what you now see, but you can control how it shapes your destiny. Finally, the transformation is irreversible. The journey from ignorance to awareness reshapes perception, identity, and life itself. Fear no longer controls you. Authority no longer dictates your morality. Ritual no longer defines your behavior. You operate from understanding, strategy, and sovereignty. You have seen the dark machinery that enslaves generations, and you now possess the tools to transcend it. This is your inheritance, the weight of forbidden knowledge, the clarity of vision, and the responsibility to wield it with intent. You are changed. You cannot return. The world appears differently, and you are no longer merely a subject of its systems. You are a master of perception, a strategist of influence, and a guardian of your own mind.